There are towns that fade from memory, not because people forget them, but because something much older decides they should be forgotten. Right now, wherever you are, I want you to think about the oldest building in your neighborhood, the one that's been there longer than anyone can remember. Now ask yourself this: what if it wasn't built there? What if it grew there? That's the question nobody in Gravers Point ever thought to ask until it was far too late. And by the time they did, asking questions had become the most dangerous thing you could possibly do. Before we go any further, leave a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. I love knowing when our community tunes in. Whether you're hiding under your covers at midnight or listening during your morning commute, you're exactly where you need to be. This is the fear behind you, and what I'm about to share with you has never been documented this way before. March of 1897 brought a stranger to Gravers Point, a logging settlement tucked so deep into the Oregon coastal range that mail arrived once a month if the weather cooperated, and twice a year if it didn't. The stranger's name was Dalton Carver, and the first thing people noticed about him wasn't his face or his clothes. It was the way he looked at buildings, not at them, into them, the way you'd examine an X-ray, searching for fractures in bones you couldn't see. Dalton was 42, tall enough that doorways seemed too small for him, with shoulders that suggested years of physical labor and hands covered in scars that formed patterns too deliberate to be accidental. His eyes were an unusual shade of amber, nearly gold in certain light, and they had a quality that made people uncomfortable. When Dalton looked at you, you got the distinct impression he was seeing something behind you, just over your shoulder, something you desperately hoped wasn't actually there. He'd arrived on foot, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and a walking stick made from wood nobody in the region recognized. Dark, almost black, with a grain that seemed to shift depending on the angle of light. When asked where he'd come from, Dalton would smile slightly and say, "East," which in Oregon could mean anywhere from 20 miles away to the opposite side of the continent. When asked what brought him to Gravers Point, he'd say he was a surveyor, which wasn't technically a lie, but wasn't quite the truth either. Gravers Point had approximately 600 residents at the time, most of them employed by the Mackenzie Timber Company, which had been systematically clearing the surrounding forests for the better part of a decade. The town consisted of 2 unpaved streets running parallel to Gravers Creek, a general store, a company office, a mill, a schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, and about 80 structures that ranged from legitimate houses to shacks that barely qualified as shelter. The town's founder, a man named Silas Graver, had died 3 years earlier, under circumstances nobody discussed in detail, but everyone knew involved the mill and a piece of equipment that had malfunctioned in a way the manufacturer insisted was mechanically impossible. After Silas died, his widow Constance had taken over operations, making her one of the only women in the Pacific Northwest running a timber company. She was 51. With steel-gray hair she kept pinned so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut, and a way of speaking that made grown men check their posture. Dalton found lodging at the boarding house run by a woman named Iris Holcomb, who was 28. Widowed 2 years prior when her husband Thomas fell from a scaffold at the mill. Iris had copper-red hair, green eyes that missed very little, and a direct manner of speaking that some found refreshing and others found unsettling. She asked Dalton straight out what he was really doing in Gravers Point, because surveyors didn't typically arrive on foot with no equipment and no commission from the timber company. Dalton set his satchel on the boarding house table and told her the truth, or at least a version of it. He said he tracked patterns in how settlements grew, specifically patterns that didn't make logical sense. Towns that expanded in directions that contradicted geography, economics, and common sense. Buildings that appeared in locations where construction should have been impossible. Communities where the architecture seemed to precede the architects, as if the structures had been waiting for people to inhabit them rather than the other way around. Iris asked why that mattered. Dalton opened his satchel and removed a notebook filled with sketches, measurements, and annotations in handwriting so precise it looked mechanical. He showed her drawings of towns across the Western Territories, all sharing certain characteristics: unusual building placements, identical architectural anomalies, and population disappearances that occurred in predictable cycles. Every 7 years, like clockwork, certain towns lost exactly 7% of their residents, not to disease, not to migration, just gone. And according to Dalton's research, Gravers Point was one of those towns. Iris studied the notebook, then looked at Dalton with an expression that suggested she was deciding whether he was brilliant or insane. She asked when the next cycle was due. Dalton closed the notebook carefully and said, 4 months from now, July. Now, while we're right here, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed something wrong with a place, but couldn't articulate exactly what it was? Just a feeling that the geometry didn't quite work, that rooms felt bigger or smaller than their dimensions suggested, that shadows fell at angles that didn't match the light source. Drop your experience in the comments, because what happened in Gravers Point will make you reconsider every building you've ever trusted. Dalton spent his first week walking the town, measuring buildings, sketching layouts, and asking questions that made people profoundly uncomfortable. He'd approach someone on the street and ask how long their house had been there. When they'd answer, "I built it 5 years ago," he'd nod and say, "Are you certain?" in a tone that made them suddenly uncertain about something they'd been absolutely sure of moments before. He paid particular attention to the older structures, the ones that predated the timber company, the ones that had supposedly been built by the first settlers. There were 7 of them scattered through town, all showing signs of age that seemed inconsistent with the town's documented history. Gravers Point had been established in 1872, 25 years earlier, but these buildings looked centuries old. The wood was weathered in ways that suggested exposure to elements far harsher than coastal Oregon rain. The joinery used techniques that hadn't been common since the early 1700s. And most significantly, every single one of these structures was built on the exact same type of foundation. Not similar foundations, identical foundations. Massive stones, each weighing several tons, arranged in circular patterns and carved with marks that weren't decoration and weren't structural. They were something else entirely. Dalton made rubbings of these marks, carefully pressing paper against the stone and running charcoal across the surface until the patterns emerged. He spent hours comparing them to references in his notebook, cross-checking against symbols he'd documented in other towns. And slowly, a picture formed that made him stop sleeping more than 3 hours a night. The marks were a language, or something like a language, not words in any conventional sense, but instructions. Architectural instructions, specifying not just how buildings should be constructed, but what they should do. And what they were instructed to do was grow. Constance Graver sent for Dalton in late March. Her office occupied the second floor of the company building, overlooking the mill where massive logs were stripped, cut, and processed into lumber that would build houses across the West. She sat behind a desk made from a single slab of Douglas fir, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. She told Dalton that his questions were disturbing her workers, that productivity had dropped 17% since his arrival, that men were refusing to enter certain buildings, claiming they felt watched. She asked him, with the precise courtesy that preceded ultimatums, whether he intended to continue his survey. Dalton asked her a question in return. He asked whether she'd noticed that the company office was larger inside than its exterior dimensions allowed. Whether she'd ever wondered why the mill processed more timber than the logs delivered to it should produce. Whether she'd ever counted how many workers reported for shifts versus how many left at the end of the day. Constance's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps admission. She said she'd noticed all of those things. She said every manager who'd worked in Gravers Point for more than a year noticed those things. And she said they'd all learned that noticing and speaking were two very different choices, and only one of those choices let you keep breathing. Dalton asked what happened to the managers who spoke. Constance stood, walked to the window, and pointed to the cemetery on the hill east of town. Then she told him his week was up, and he should leave before his observations became permanent. But Dalton didn't leave. Instead, he did something that nobody expected. He took a job at the mill. The mill operated 20 hours a day in 2 shifts, processing logs that came down from the mountains on a flume system that had been built the same year the town was founded. Dalton joined the night shift, working alongside men who spoke little and watched much. Men whose hands were scarred from years of handling raw timber, and whose eyes held the particular exhaustion that comes from seeing things you've trained yourself not to acknowledge. The mill itself was a cathedral of wood and iron, 3 stories tall, filled with saws and conveyors and machinery that roared with a sound that made conversation impossible. The night shift ran from 8 in the evening to 4 in the morning, and the work was brutal, dangerous, and mind-numbing. But Dalton wasn't there to work. He was there to watch. And what he saw confirmed everything he'd feared. The logs that came down the flume were measured when they arrived. Standard procedure, necessary for calculating yield and profit. But the lumber that left the mill, carefully stacked and ready for shipment, exceeded what those logs should have produced. Not by a little, by 30 to 40%. The math didn't work. The physics didn't work. But the lumber was real, solid, usable. It was as if the mill was adding material, pulling it from somewhere, and incorporating it into the boards that would be shipped to build homes, stores, schools across the Pacific Northwest. Dalton began tracking where those shipments went. The mill kept meticulous records, and after his shifts, while others slept, he'd copy shipping manifests, documenting every destination. And he discovered something that made his hands shake as he wrote. Every town that received lumber from Gravers Point eventually developed the same patterns, the same architectural anomalies, the same 7-year cycles, the same population disappearances. The mill wasn't just producing lumber, it was producing infection, sending it out like seeds that would take root and grow into something that resembled a town, but wasn't quite right, wasn't quite real, was something else wearing a town's skin. In April, a mill worker named Samuel Pryor disappeared. Samuel was 36, married with 3 children, not the type to wander off. His wife Rachel reported him missing when he didn't return from his shift. The mill foreman, a man named Dutch Kohler, checked the logs and insisted Samuel had clocked out at 4 in the morning like everyone else. But Rachel had been awake at 4. Samuel hadn't come home. She'd waited, growing increasingly worried, and had come looking for him at dawn. The mill was empty by then, the machinery silent, the workspace abandoned until the day shift arrived at noon. Dalton helped search. They found Samuel's lunch pail in the mill, his coat hanging on its usual hook, his time card properly punched. But Samuel himself was nowhere. They searched for 3 days. The woods, the creek, every building in town. Nothing. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle. Samuel Pryor had simply ceased to exist somewhere between clocking out and going home, a distance of perhaps half a mile along a well-traveled road. Iris came to Dalton's room that evening. She'd brought coffee and a question she'd clearly been avoiding. She asked if he'd known this would happen, if his research predicted not just the pattern, but the specific people. Dalton said he'd known a disappearance was likely. The cycles always began with one person, then escalated. He said Samuel wouldn't be the last, and he said it with a sorrow that suggested he'd watched this pattern repeat too many times to count. Iris asked why he kept coming to these towns if he knew what would happen. Dalton said someone had to witness, had to document, had to understand. Because understanding was the only possible path to stopping it, and stopping it mattered more than his safety, or his sanity, or his life. 2 weeks later, a child went missing. Clara Hobbs, 8 years old, with blonde braids and a gap-toothed smile. She'd been playing in her yard one moment, and the next, she was simply gone. Her mother's scream brought half the town running, but there was nothing to find. No tracks, no torn clothing, no sign that Clara had been taken by an animal or a person. But Dalton found something the others missed. In the dirt where Clara had been playing, there were marks. The same marks he'd found on the foundation stones, fresh as if recently pressed into the soil. And the marks formed a circle exactly 7 feet in diameter, with Clara's small handprints in the center, pressed down as if she'd been pushed from above with tremendous force. Pushed down into earth that should have been solid, but somehow wasn't. The town began to fracture. Families packed their belongings and left, unwilling to wait and see who disappeared next. But not everyone could leave. Some, like Iris, had nowhere else to go. Others, like Constance, felt bound by duty or pride or something less definable, a sense that leaving would be abandoning something essential, even if they couldn't articulate what. And some people, Dalton noticed, simply couldn't leave. They'd pack their wagons, climb aboard, head down the road out of town, and within a mile they'd turn around and come back. When asked why, they'd say they'd forgotten something, or changed their mind, or felt a pull they couldn't resist. Their eyes, when they said this, were distant, unfocused, as if they were watching something happen in a room only they could see. In May, Dalton made his most significant discovery. He'd been measuring the 7 original buildings, tracking how they related spatially to each other, and he realized they weren't randomly placed. They formed a pattern, a geometric shape that resembled a constellation he'd seen in indigenous petroglyphs throughout the region. A pattern that wasn't just decorative. It was functional. The buildings were markers, anchor points for something vast and complex that existed beneath the town. He began excavating, carefully digging beside the foundation stones, going down through layers of soil and clay until 4 feet down he hit something that shouldn't have been there. Wood. Not rotten, not decayed. Fresh wood, recently milled, forming structures underground that mirrored the buildings above. The town didn't just exist on the surface. It extended downward, buildings beneath buildings, streets beneath streets. A complete inverted duplicate of Graver's Point, existing in the earth like a reflection in dark water. And the reflection was growing. Every board milled, every structure built above ground was simultaneously being constructed below. The town was building its own shadow, and that shadow was becoming more solid, more real, with each passing day. Dalton brought Iris and Constance to see what he'd found. They stood at the edge of his excavation, looking down at wooden walls that gleamed wetly in lamplight, and Constance said something that made Dalton's blood go cold. She said, "My husband found this 7 years ago, this exact thing in this exact spot. And 3 days later, he went to work at the mill and never came home. Azanius, the July cycle was approaching." Dalton calculated they had perhaps 3 weeks before it triggered fully, before the pattern completed itself and Graver's Point experienced whatever the other towns had experienced. Population loss of 7% meant approximately 42 people would vanish. 42 people pulled down into that underground reflection, added to whatever was building itself beneath their feet. Unless he could stop it. And stopping it meant understanding what he was dealing with. Not a creature, not a spirit, but something architectural, something that existed as structure itself, that thought in terms of geometry and growth, that couldn't be killed because it wasn't alive, but could potentially be disrupted. The foundations were the key, the marked stones anchoring the 7 original buildings. They weren't just markers, they were roots, feeding whatever was growing below. If he could remove them, destabilize them, perhaps the entire system would collapse. He shared this theory with Iris and Constance. They looked at each other, then back at him, and Constance said, "Those stones each weigh 3 tons. They've been there for decades, maybe centuries. How exactly do you propose moving them?" Dalton smiled grimly and said, "The same way they got there in the first place, the mill." The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Use the mill's equipment to extract the foundation stones one by one, breaking the geometric pattern. The mill had cranes, pulleys, and enough raw power to lift massive logs. It could lift stones. But they'd need to work fast. And they'd need to work at night, when the mill was supposedly empty, because Dalton suspected that anyone working there during the day would stop them. The mill itself would stop them. It was part of the structure, part of the growth. It would protect itself. They started on July 3rd. Dalton, Iris, Constance, and 4 workers who Constance trusted absolutely. Men who'd been with her since before Silas died. Men who'd seen things that made them willing to believe Dalton's impossible theory. They brought equipment to the first building, an old supply shed on the east edge of town. They dug out around the foundation stone, exposing it fully, chains around it, and connected those chains to the mill's crane system. And when they started the engine, when they began to lift, the stone resisted in a way that stone shouldn't resist. It didn't just refuse to move. It pulled back. The chains went taut, vibrating like guitar strings, and the stone seemed to sink deeper, as if the earth beneath was swallowing it, refusing to let go. They increased power. The crane groaned, metal stressed beyond its design. And finally, with a sound like bones breaking, the stone moved. It rose out of the earth, trailing roots, not plant roots, but wooden roots, fine tendrils of grain and fiber that had grown from the stone into the soil, connecting it to something deeper. The moment the stone cleared the ground, everyone present felt it. A shift, like pressure changing in your ears, like the world adjusting itself. And from the direction of the mill, they heard something that made them all turn. Machinery starting up, the saws engaging, the conveyors moving. The mill was operating on its own, and they were nowhere near it. They loaded the stone onto a wagon and moved to the second location. They worked faster now, digging frantically, knowing that whatever ran the mill had noticed them. The second stone came free easier, as if removing the first had weakened the entire system. By the time they reached the third building, dawn was approaching. They'd worked through the night, exhausted, hands bleeding, but driven by the certainty that stopping meant being caught. And they all understood, without discussing it, what being caught would mean. They'd join Samuel Pryor and Clara Hobbs and all the others. They'd be pulled down into that reflection and become part of whatever was building itself beneath Graver's Point. The third stone was under the schoolhouse. This one fought harder than the others. When they finally extracted it, the building above groaned, its walls cracking, and something dark leaked from those cracks. Not water, not oil. Something that looked like wood grain rendered liquid, flowing down the walls and soaking into the earth, searching for the stone they'd removed. 4 stones remained, but the sun was rising, and people were waking, and Constance said they needed to stop, regroup, finish it the next night. Dalton wanted to argue, wanted to push through, but he could see exhaustion in everyone's faces. They were operating on adrenaline and terror, and that fuel eventually runs out. They hid the 3 stones they'd removed, burying them in a ravine far from town, and they tried to rest. But rest was impossible, because throughout that day, July 4th, Graver's Point began to react. Buildings that had stood for years suddenly developed cracks. Streets that had been level tilted slightly, just enough to notice. And the sounds, everyone in town heard the sounds. A low groaning from beneath their feet, like wood under stress, like something vast shifting its weight. People fled. By afternoon, half the town was empty, wagons streaming away, families abandoning everything they couldn't carry. And this time, nobody turned back. The pull that had kept people trapped seemed to have weakened. Removing those 3 stones had loosened something's grip. That evening, as Dalton prepared to return to the work, Iris stopped him. She asked if he was certain this would work. If destroying the pattern would destroy whatever was growing, or if it would just make it angry. Dalton admitted he didn't know. Every town he'd studied had completed the pattern. This was the first time he'd arrived early enough to intervene. They were in uncharted territory. But doing nothing wasn't an option, and she knew that as well as he did. They returned to work at midnight. 4 stones remained. They moved through the town like ghosts, trying to work quietly, but stealth was impossible with heavy equipment. People watched from windows, faces pale in lamplight, but nobody interfered. They wanted this to end as much as Dalton did. The 4th stone came from beneath the general store, the 5th from beneath a house that had been abandoned years ago. With each extraction, the sounds from beneath town intensified, that groaning becoming something almost vocal, almost linguistic, as if the structure itself was learning to scream. The 6th stone was under the boarding house where Dalton had first stayed. Iris stood in her doorway watching as they dug around her foundation, and Dalton saw fear in her eyes, but also determination. When the stone came free, the boarding house shuddered but held. 1 stone remained, the largest, the oldest, the one beneath the company office where Constance worked. This was the center point, the anchor around which all others orbited. They brought the equipment and began to dig. The earth here was different, darker, dense with those wooden rootlets. They had to cut through them with axes, and when they did, the wood bled that dark liquid, pooling in the excavation, making the work treacherous. The stone, when they finally exposed it, was massive, twice the size of the others. And it was warm, not sun-warmed, warm from within, radiating heat like something living. The marks carved into its surface were deeper, more complex, and they seemed to move in the torchlight, rearranging themselves, trying different patterns, as if searching for the one that would make them stay. They got chains around it. They connected it to the crane. They engaged the engine, and immediately everything went wrong. The mill, silent until now, erupted. Every saw, every conveyor, every piece of machinery activated simultaneously, screaming at a pitch that shattered windows across town. And from the mill, from the underground passages Dalton had discovered, people emerged. Not people, shapes of people. Samuel Pryor was among them, and Clara Hobbs, and others Dalton didn't recognize, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all walking with the same strange gait, too smooth, too fluid, as if their joints bent in ways human joints shouldn't. They moved toward the excavation site, not running, walking, but covering distance with impossible speed, as if the ground compressed beneath them, bringing them closer with each step. Dalton shouted to keep the engine running, to lift the stone no matter what. The crane groaned, metal screaming, and the stone began to rise. The figures from the mill surrounded them now, reaching with hands that were too long, fingers that terminated in points like wood splinters. But they didn't attack. They just watched, standing in a circle, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting lamplight with a quality that eyes shouldn't have. The stone came free, and when it did, everything stopped. The mill went silent, the figures froze, and the ground beneath Graver's Point began to shake. Not an earthquake, something more deliberate, something collapsing from within. The inverted town, the shadow beneath the surface, was losing coherence. Without its anchors, without those 7 stones holding the pattern, it couldn't maintain itself. Buildings across Graver's Point began to sink, slowly, their foundations dropping into earth that had suddenly become hollow. The streets cracked open, revealing darkness beneath, and from that darkness rose air that smelled of sawdust and something older, something that had been trapped underground for so long it had forgotten what sky looked like. The figures that had emerged from the mill didn't sink. They dissolved. They came apart like reflections when water is disturbed, breaking into fragments, pieces, and finally, nothing. Samuel Pryor's face was the last thing Dalton saw clearly, and in that final moment, Samuel's eyes focused, truly focused, and he mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Then he was gone. They were all gone. And Gravers Point, the surface town, the real town, stood empty and damaged but still standing, liberated from whatever had been growing beneath it. Dalton stood in the wreckage with Iris and Constance and the few workers who'd helped them, watching dawn break over a town that had survived something it should never have had to face. Constance said they'd need to evacuate everyone remaining, condemn the buildings, abandon the site entirely. She said nobody would believe what had happened, but that didn't matter. The important thing was making sure it never happened again. Dalton showed her his notebook, filled with locations of other towns, other mills, other places where lumber from Gravers Point had been shipped. He said his work wasn't finished. It was just beginning. Iris asked if he'd keep traveling, keep tracking the pattern. Dalton nodded. She asked if he wanted company. He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, and said he'd never turn down competent help. Gravers Point was officially closed in August of 1897. The remaining residents were relocated, the buildings condemned, and within 2 years the forest had reclaimed most of the site. The Mackenzie Timber Company dissolved, its assets sold, its records sealed. And if you look today at maps of the Oregon coastal range, you'll find no mention of Gravers Point, as if it had never existed at all. But Dalton Carver's notebook survived. It passed through several hands over the decades, ending up in a private collection in Portland. And according to that notebook, Dalton and Iris spent the next 12 years tracking the pattern, finding the places where lumber from Gravers Point had taken root, intervening before the cycles completed. The final entry in the notebook is dated 1909 in a town called Mercer Falls in Northern California. Dalton wrote simply, "Found all 7, removed them, pattern broken, moving on." And then, in handwriting that might have been Iris's, 26 towns cleared. How many remain? That question was never answered. Dalton and Iris disappeared from record after 1909, and the notebook offers no clues about what happened to them. But here's what keeps me up at night. Lumber from Gravers Point was shipped across the western United States for nearly a decade. Thousands of structures were built with that wood, in towns that still exist, in buildings people still occupy. And if Dalton's theory was correct, if that lumber carried infection, carried the ability to grow reflections beneath the surface, then somewhere, in towns we've never heard of, the pattern might still be active. Structures might still be growing underground, invisible, patient, waiting for the right conditions to complete their cycles. So if you're listening to this in an old house, in a building that's been there longer than anyone can quite remember, in a place where the floors are slightly too warm and the dimensions don't quite add up, and 7% of your neighbors seem to disappear every few years and nobody talks about it, you might want to check your foundation. You might want to see what's carved into those stones. And if you find marks that don't look like any language you recognize, patterns that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them, do yourself a favor. Don't try to understand them. Don't try to translate them. Just leave. Pack your things, leave the door open, and don't look back. Because some structures were never meant to be inhabited. They were meant to do the inhabiting. If this story made you look at your own home differently, if you're going to be checking your basement tonight with a flashlight you didn't plan on using, share this with someone who needs a reason to question the architecture around them. And if you've ever lived in a place that felt like it was watching you, like it knew you better than it should, tell us about it in the comments. This has been The Fear Behind You. Stay skeptical, stay aware, and remember, the scariest structures are the ones that build themselves while you sleep.